This occurred in Lynn County, Iowa, where I experienced something that I cannot explain. This was years ago. I was actually selling one of my friends some weed, and I wanted to meet him in a secluded spot. I told him it would be best if we could meet at a good spot at night. Cedar Lake near the Quaker Oats plant. We decided to meet in Mohawk Park after hours and do our deal since it would be dark, and when parks are closed down, it's much easier for hiding. I parked along Bluff Road and walked my happy ass into the park at night, and I met my friend there. We both dressed dark as to try and be as incognito as possible, and I think it worked. We did not see any police patrolling the area, so we decided to walk along the part of the park where there is a shoreline that stretches out into the Cedar River. Keep in mind there's thick brush and forest all around us on the shore and the river. We sit down, make sure we are entirely out of view, and then we have some small talk, do our deal. I tell him instead of us both leave at the same time, it would look awfully fishy. So I told him, why don't you go ahead in front of me and go back to your car? Then I would follow suit about 10 minutes later and walk back to my car alone. I figured this would be much safer, considering if there was a patrolling officer, he wouldn't see two guys coming out of the park, since that would look suspicious. I'd rather him only see one guy. I sat on the sand and watched him walk away. The night around me was quiet, and there wasn't a whole lot of noise going on. I'm sitting there, giving him a good 10 minutes or so to get ahead of me before I wanted to get up and leave. About 5 minutes goes by, and I began to hear some sort of sniffing sounds, and it sounds like it's coming from right behind me in the brush. I turned my head, and the first thing I saw was these large red eyes glaring at me. They had a dull glow to them, and I'll never forget it. This animal stepped partially out of the brush and was at least 9 feet tall, and had to be well over 500 pounds. I know this had to be factual, because I'm 6'2" myself and weigh around 250 pounds. There was enough light coming from the moon that I could, unfortunately, make out too many details I didn't want to see. It had long pointed ears on top of its head, with little tufts of fur at the very top. Its muzzle was long, and had a considerable amount of gray in its fur, and all along its muzzle. It just stared intently into my soul. In the dim light, I could clearly see this thing breathing, its muscles moving, its chest expanding with every breath. This was not a person in some costume. I was convinced I was staring at a real-life werewolf. Time felt as though it had entirely stopped, and I was frozen standing there, only 15 feet away from this animal. It didn't move. It only continued to stare at me. Every part of my body was screaming to run away as fast as I could, but I just could not muster the courage to do so, in fear of this thing running me down and eating me alive. I slowly began to step away, back towards where me and my friend had came from, walking backwards slowly, never taking my eyes off of this animal. I made sure to walk slowly, and this thing's eyes followed my every movement. It was very calculated, like it was studying my movements. I'm surprised I didn't shit myself on the spot. I was so scared. I kept stepping back more and more, and after I gained about 60 or so feet from this animal, it quickly turned around back into the brush. I panicked, immediately thinking this was going to come after me through the brush and grab me. I turned around and bolted out of there as fast as I could to get back to my vehicle. I made it out of the park and got back to my car, and I never saw a cop car, which is surprising, but I think it worked out in my favor. I've actually really never told anyone about what happened to me that night. Not even my friend who I sold the weed to. I really struggled with it for a long time after, having horrible nightmares, sleepless nights, and anxiety. I couldn't honestly tell you if I even believed myself that I saw it for a while afterwards that it happened. It's taken me years to come to terms with it, and even then I don't like to think about it. How can something like this exist without the general public knowing? How come we as people aren't informed about these things? Are these really werewolves, or an animal that resembles them? We'll probably never know the true answers to any of these questions. So, a couple of days ago, my boyfriend and I were driving up his road that's in the middle of the woods, and as we turn a corner, we see a dead deer in the middle of the road. The dead deer wasn't even dead long, it looked like, and it was pretty fresh as we were coming up the road, which was weird since there's no other cars that come up this road. Then we saw it. Now, I'm not normally a scared person, but seeing this thing almost made me piss myself. It looked as if this thing was eating the dead deer. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, very thin, and it was all black with a long muzzle and pointed ears. It ran up right in front of the car, and my boyfriend slammed on the brakes, turns to me and says, "Tell me what you saw," and asked me to describe it to him as to make sure he wasn't going crazy. I did, and we sped all the way home. This all happened in about a minute, although it felt like longer. I was telling my dad about it, and he saw the exact creature years earlier at my sister's bus stop. He tried to convince my sister it was just a black dog or something, but my sister's response was, "Daddy, that thing was too fast and too big to be a doggy." And all my dad could say was, "I don't know." If anyone has any idea what this could be, I appreciate it. I'm very skeptical about these things, and I'm looking for a more logical explanation. I guess I'll start with the background. I'm a 33-year-old female, but this story takes place when I was a teenager, living in a suburb of Chicago. The village I lived in was quiet and middle class. We lived like a mile from the police station, and the worst crimes we had was a murder or two, and a robbery, once in a blue moon. 99% of the time, boring, and more boring. Unless you had a car, you were stuck just walking around the park at night with your friends. Kind of boring. Anyway, one night, my girlfriend and I decided to go hang out at a park with some guys at like midnight. The night was a bit windy and had a full moon. I even got a kiss that night from the boy I liked. But the night wasn't just fun and hanging out late. There's a deep forest in the park with a stream, with a playground right next to it. The same playground we went to, with swings and jungle gym columns. There's 2 bridges, one of the wooden ones, it's the one that everybody uses, and one bridge made of rocks that's rarely used because it is deeper in the forest over the stream, connecting the 2 halves of the forest park area. I'll get to the rock bridge in a minute. We hung around on the swings and chatted and just spent the evening together. I'm sitting and just looking around, talking and enjoying the peace and quiet and the moonlight. I have a full view of the forest and the dip of the earth that I know that leads to the stream. I see something moving over the dip of the earth. Some dark shape. It looked like it was crawling out of the forest. An arm, then another arm. Then I see this humongous looking dog head that resembled the Doberman Pinscher's head. It pulls itself out of the ditch/stream, a figure darker than the surrounding forest. And I'm sitting there, frozen. I think I'm seeing things. It just kind of lies there on the ground, but doesn't move. A flash of fear grips me. What if it comes this way? I look to my friends and no one notices anything. I look back and it's gone. Did it go back or somewhere? I really want to get out there and check. Then one friend asks, "Did you guys hear about the urban legend of the rock bridge over the stream?" Apparently, some kids or something played on the bridge and fell over and died. What a thing to say after what I saw. I didn't ask anyone anything and just pretended I didn't see a thing. But the experience stuck with me. I never talked about it because I must have really been my imagination. Things like that happen only in scary movies though, right? But I rarely went to the park after that. And the black thing, if you are real, I hope we never meet again. Who knows what would have happened if you would have saw me the same time I saw you? Could it have been the notorious Dogman that's talked about being seen in the area? I don't know, and I'm glad I didn't find out. The following is a very true experience. I've never actually written this down before, and I don't know if anyone has experienced this too. This happened between 89 and 90, and I was about the age of 4 at the time. To this day, I still get chills thinking about it, and I wonder if in some way unknown, it changed me. My parents had a house in the Inland Empire of Southern California, and at the time, my brother hadn't been born yet, so I was still the only child. To give you a layout, my parents' house was a 2-story house located in a cul-de-sac. On the bottom floor, there was 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, the living room, and the kitchen. The second floor was just the master bedroom and bath. All you could see from the street was the garage and one of the bedroom windows on the bottom floor, and the window of my mom's bathroom on the second floor. To get to the front door, you had to walk along the cement pathway that ran along the side of the house. You had to pass the first bedroom that you could see from the street. Then you passed the bathroom window, and then another bedroom window. And then you would be at the front door. The backyard was beyond that point. My bedroom at the time was the bedroom next to the front door. Now, for some reason, my blinds weren't completely down to the bottom of the window. There was about a 6-inch gap with nothing covering it. I was pretty young, so I didn't really care much about it then. The bed was in the middle of the wall, across from my bedroom door, and to the left was the window. According to my mom, this all happened right before midnight. My mother was asleep in her room upstairs, and my dad was a policeman that worked nights in another city. I was fast asleep in my room, and out of nowhere, I suddenly awoke, looking up at the ceiling. I don't know what woke me up, or if I just popped awake on my own. After my eyes adjusted to the night's light of my bedroom, I sat up and started looking around my room. All of a sudden, something caught my eye at the window in the gap. First, I thought it was the streetlights reflecting on the window, but I knew for a fact there was only one streetlight, and that I was looking at 2 obvious glowing spots that were spaced apart as if it was an animal's face. Then I thought, is a cat looking at me? And yes, I vividly remember thinking these things, trying to debunk this at 4 years old. I had remembered then that my cat Chelsea's eyes would reflect at night, but this looked different than that. The cat's eyes would almost have different colors when reflecting. These were 2 very solid, bright, amber, glowing eyes, looking straight at me. I just stared at them, frozen stiff, trying to make sense out of what I'm seeing. I couldn't see a face at all. The eyes were just so bright, and nothing else stood out. That void or face around the eyes looked blacker than the night, but looked in the shape of a big wolf head. I thought again, well, if this is a cat, how would a cat be big like a person, and why would a cat stand up and stare in my room? The curiosity got to me, and I went for it. I flipped my covers off, turned my little 4-year-old body towards the window, and put my feet on the floor. This is the moment the creepiest thing happened, and it will forever be burned into my brain. I got off the bed and got on my knees to get a closer look at this so-called cat, when at this very moment, these pair of glowing eyes begins to slowly and steadily tilt to the side. Very similar to Michael Myers in Halloween. Eyes are still locked on me, not blinking once. The feeling of dread and fear shot through my body. Completely terrified, I burst into tears immediately and booked it down the hallway, through the living room, and up the stairs to tell my mom. Although I was going as fast as I could, it felt like it took forever. When I got to my mom, I was so upset. I couldn't get any words out. Tears were streaming down my face, and my mom was becoming seriously concerned at this point. She was able to calm me down just enough for me to get the words out. Their red eyes looking at me through my window, on the bottom. Stuttering and crying hard. Are you sure? My mom asked, and I just cry out yes. She didn't even go to look. She just called the police. I don't remember the time it took for them to arrive or what they said because I finally fell asleep in my mom's bed. I do remember faintly waking up to a knock on the door and my mom going to open it. The cop speaks to her and I hear her say, "Okay, thank you, good night," and he shuts the door. Did they find it, Mommy? I asked half asleep. No, honey. He said they couldn't find anyone. My mom told me softly. It's okay now, just try to go back to sleep. It's safe to say that the next day, my whole window was covered. Years fast forward and I'm in middle school. Every now and then I would think about that night. Sometimes I wondered if that moment was real, if those eyes were really there, those unforgettable, amber-colored eyes. One day, a random thought came up and I asked my mom if she remembered that night. She tells me, "Yes, of course, why?" "I don't know, just wondering," I said. Then my mom proceeds to say, "Well, I never told you this, but when the deputy came out that night, he told me they made it a priority to get out to our house as soon as they could, because not very long before I called 911, they received another call from someone else reporting that a large dog was looking in their window, in our same neighborhood." Hearing that sent chills down my spine, and to this day I wonder, what was looking at me that night? Now, this isn't a scary story, but more creepy than scary. My friend's dad's family used to live in the woods near Eureka Springs, Arkansas. My friend's uncle was the oldest of 3 kids and was allowed to explore the woods on his own, even though he was only about 9. One day he came across a little cottage nestled in the woods. He knocked on the door and was greeted by 2 older ladies. He promptly asked for some water, as he had been exploring for hours. The ladies invited him in and gave him milk and cookies, and sat down and talked with him while he pet their white cat. They talked for a while, and they eventually invited him to stay for dinner and to spend the night because it was getting dark and he was a ways from home. His parents were pretty used to him being in the woods for nights without coming back, so he accepted without question. He spent the night without incident and returned home the next morning. He visited many more times over the following year, and one day they told him that to bring his parents and brothers the next time he came. So the next week, the whole family embarked on a long trek to the cottage. When they arrived, however, they found the remains of a small cottage that appeared to have been abandoned for years. Everyone was really confused, as they all trusted that my friend's uncle had visited the woman many times. They had absolutely no idea what had happened, or if my friend's uncle had actually been visiting anybody. What made things even creepier was that everyone heard the low growling and the distant howls from the forest, and seeing moving black figures in the woodline, watching them, growling. To make things even creepier, they found out later that the area had been previously housing an Indian burial mound that was actually removed from construction many years ago. Who knows, maybe they saw an illusion of black magic. Maybe these dog creatures are in the area and used this illusion to trick him into bringing the whole family back to the area to eat. But they never attacked, and to this day I'm not sure what became of it or what the area is now. All I know is, if it has anything to do with Indian burial mounds or black magic, there's always seems to be a trace of evil in the area, and this was it. Okay, so I don't really know how to start the story off, but it just happened like an hour ago, and I'm still spooked. So a bit of a preface. Me and my friend are home alone right now, and have been for a few hours. Every time he comes over, we go to the woods by my house, and it's normally uneventful, with some throwing rocks and breaking trees and stuff. Harmless fun. But this time, something else happened. Like I said, we're home alone and have been for a while, and while this happened, we were obviously home alone. We went outside to go to the woods, and the trip there was uneventful, but once we got there, something was off. Everything was dark, tons of trees had been knocked down, and the entire place was not like I remembered it being. We kept going in, still having our usual harmless fun, and at one point my friend turned to me and said we should go back. I looked at my phone and decided it had only been 30 minutes, and so we might as well stay longer, 'cause it'll be a few hours until anyone would want us to be home. We continued on, finding a few strange things, like an old crushed Mountain Dew can, probably 10 to 20 years old, and a toy boat which had been completely destroyed by the wind and water and other elements of nature, and was probably even older than the can. Our plan was to go further than that I had ever been deeper into the woods, which isn't very hard for us, because I've barely been that deep. After walking for a while, we came to a landmark I knew that was marked about the deepest I've ever been in. A while ago, when I was going far in, I came upon a bridge built on a log that had fallen over a river in the middle of the woods. However, one thing was different. There was something sitting on top of it. Whatever was on it was small and resembled the head of an animal. When we got closer and got a good view of it, it was a deer skull, pearly white and clean, sitting on the bridge, with no clue as to who put it there and where the rest of it was. Behind the river, there was a huge hill with a creepy small house on it, and while we were looking around, I heard a low, deep, guttural growl. Like, it sounded so low you could feel the vibrations. I freaked out. We began to run, and from behind me, I hear my friend screaming, and I hear him running behind me. We both keep running, and once we reach the edge of the woods, we step out onto the road. As I step out onto the road, I turn around and I see this upright, German Shepherd-looking animal standing where we were. My friend and I both screamed werewolf at the same time. We bolted and we quickly made our way home. And when we got there, the garage door was wide open. Not knowing if it was left open or not, we ran inside, locking the door, checking the house, and turning the alarm on. I hope that thing didn't track our scent and follow us back to the house. So, I used to hear a ton of stories about ghosts, and also watch a lot of horror movies. But since I had never experienced anything paranormal, I was a guy who was like, this stuff is just created by people to make money out of, and all other sorts of crap like that. Okay, let's get on to the story. One day, me and my two friends visited this spooky-looking forest. Not nearby, but we managed to get there just to check it out as we love the natural atmosphere. You know, giving my lungs some adrenaline of fresh air. The time we reached there was about 7 p.m., when it was already getting dark, and just to let you know, there's no light source in the forest except the entrance/exit of the area, so it was much darker and thicker than you would expect. My friend had his Apple, and I had my Tab with a dual flash, so we decided to use them at least to see each other. An hour passed by of just having conversation and smoking cigarettes. We were sitting under a tree, as it was thick enough for all of us to lay our backs on and sit and relax. We were having a good time until we started hearing a sound, like two rocks are smashing into each other, or one rock smashing on the ground again and again. We were confused. I told my friends that it must be a cat trying to climb a tree, making the weak branches fall off, and making it sound like the rock thing. But it didn't stop for like 3 or 4 minutes though. Now, after some minutes, it did stop for a while, and we were still assuming it was an animal doing the sounds. Things went silent for a few moments. We started our conversation about the forest atmosphere being so windy and cold and staticky. Then apparently a rock fell on my friend's head. Wonder how a rock can be up there on a tree. Just in a few seconds, a big branch from the tree fell on my lap, scaring the shit out of me, and once again my friend felt like water drops falling on his neck from up in the tree. How is there still a chance of water dropping from a tree when the rainy season was already over 2 months ago? Now things get even more quiet, and we begin to feel like we're being stalked. Something is up in the trees watching us. Maybe multiple things, we weren't sure. We both feel eyes on us and begin to see shadows in the trees. I happen to look to my right, and up on a branch, about 30 feet up in the air, I see this hyena wolf looking hybrid son of a bitch. I don't know how else to describe it to you. It was ugly. It looked horrible. It had huge fangs that hung out of its mouth, and it was crouching on a branch. But it was ridiculous because it looked so humongous, and I don't know how the branch below it supported its weight. Granted, it was a pretty thick branch, but still, it was easily the size of a cow, in my opinion. It started growling at us once it noticed that we noticed it. It showed us its teeth. Immediately, without any options to choose, we both decided to run out of the forest as quickly as we could, totally ignoring the whole don't ever run from predators. I'm honestly surprised it never chased us down, but maybe we had just wandered into this animal's territory. We left the forest safely and headed back to our house. I know you might not believe me, and trust me, I understand. I'm terrible at recounting what happened, but I swear this is what we experienced, and I never knew unknown animals like that existed. I'm not sure if such a thing like a wolf and hyena hybrid cross is a thing, or if that these kinds of animals live up in trees or in the forest, but it's what we experienced, and I know not to return to that area again, for I feel that I may have encountered the den of these animals the further we went into the woods. Throughout the day, we take our 2 dogs outside to their kennels so they can get out of the house for a while and run and play. These are not small dogs. One is a black lab husky mix, and the other one is a full-blooded Staffordshire Terrier, also known as pit bulls. The kennels are placed at the edge of the yard near the wood line. These woods are large, huge enough to take a day to go hiking through. Lately, when it gets dark, the dogs seem on edge. They will bark and whine toward the house to come in. At first, I figured they just wanted to get back into the house, but now I'm thinking that they're genuinely scared. 3 nights ago, when I went to get them, it was already dark, but we have a security light, so it isn't pitch black or anything. I got to the front of the first kennel and noticed that both dogs were being quiet. They always bark at me excitedly when I go to get to them, but they were dead silent. This weirded me out a little, but not to the point of being scared. I will admit that there was a certain uneasiness in the air though, something I can't explain. It kind of felt like electricity was in the air, like I was about to be shocked. The longer I was there, the more uneasy I felt. I started getting the first dog, the lab, out and heard a heavy snap in the woods near the kennels. I froze. The dogs froze. By this time, I was so on edge that if somebody had spoken, I would have jumped, screamed, and possibly ran. The creepy feeling in the air just kept getting thicker. The lab had her bushy tail stuffed underneath her and was whining. This didn't make me feel any better. The pit bull was far away from the woods as she can get, whimpering for me to come get her. I can only take 1 dog in at a time because they get too excited and will sometimes try to fight, so I avoid that at all costs. I felt so bad leaving the pitty there by herself, but I had to do it. As I walked away, she barked this high-pitched whining type of bark at me that I have never heard her do before. The lab couldn't get to the house quick enough. I went back for the other one and dreaded every step as her door is right at the base of the woods. I would have to turn my back to the woods to open her door and get her out. The air felt heavy and stale, with an unpleasant smell, like rotting meat and wet dog, as I approached the kennel. Another snap, and I was about ready to run for it. But I didn't want to leave my dog, who had her head down defensively, facing the woods. I could barely make it. To be honest, it felt like trying to walk through water. I was terrified by the time I reached the door. I heard a heavy panting behind me as I got my dog out. She was scared too, but starting to growl from what was ever behind me. I was frozen in place. The panting continued for a minute before I heard it get louder, and I heard steps coming toward us. We both took off at the same time. A terrifying howl-like scream came out of the base of the woods, and I didn't dare look back. I just ran. My pity pulled me all the way back to the house. I got in, flipped off all the lights, and stared at the window at the woods. I could see something moving slightly, but just out of the light. It moved back and forth for about 5 minutes, and then disappeared. Whatever it was darker than night itself. It was so dark that it even stood out in the darkness as being something that was darker than the darkness itself. It took me forever to fall asleep that night because I was so scared that every little noise freaked me out. The next night, I went to go get the dogs earlier, right around dusk. I thought all was good until I was getting my pity out again. A huge snapping sound, like a tree branch had just been snapped in half, rang out. It sounded pretty far away, so I just hurriedly got my dog and started toward the house. A few steps away from the kennel, I heard something big start charging toward me from inside the woods. It sounded like it was on 4 legs. We ran again and it appeared to follow for so long, then retreated back. Now, every night then, I hear sounds coming out of the woods, like branches breaking, leaves or brush being stepped on and crushed, heavy panting, low growling, and sometimes an occasional howl. I am absolutely terrified. I no longer even take my dogs down. I just take them for walks during the day and make sure we were all in before dusk. I don't know what to do. I'm thinking about buying a gun, but I'm not sure it will help. Do you guys have any idea what I might be dealing with? And if so, do any of you recommend any good weapons to deal with this issue?
Hello, everyone. I live in southern Ohio, and I've had some pretty scary experiences with the so-called Dogman in the area. I'll fill you in a little bit on the details of my story. My folks own a large amount of property. I believe it ends up being roughly 50 plus acres of woodland. Well, not all of it, but a lot of it. Our property's landscape is a little more evenly spaced out. Many pastures with loose trees here and there. My dad was out splitting wood in the early AM. I want to say roughly 7 in the morning. The sun was out. The life of the nearby woods was starting to come alive with the noise and sounds of nature. Out of the corner of my father's eyes, he noticed this large, upright canine figure watching him. It was from a distance, so he couldn't make out the exact details, but this thing was watching him intently. He continued splitting wood like normal. This thing continued to watch him for a few more moments and said that eventually this thing walked off through the woods just a bit and then crossed over their long driveway to the other patch of thicker brush. He said because it moved so fast, he didn't feel like he was able to get a good look at its face, but said it was much more slender. He said he didn't even see a tail and very thin fur. He said it wasn't shaggy at all. It had haunches just like a dog does, but moved really awkwardly, like it was uncomfortable in its own body or something like that. My dad was a little unnerved by this whole ordeal because, as far as we knew, there wasn't any large dogs or anything like that on the property. He said this thing was walking on two legs when it must have been behind the trees watching him. He said it was walking bipedally as it crossed the driveway as well. This happened just last summer. I've since moved away for college, but my parents have told me about seeing this more on their property. My dad says that he's seeing it traveling close to the house during the afternoon. He believes this thing closely watches the house. He also said there's sometimes at night he could hear something heavy walking outside the house and tapping on the windows. He said he thinks it's this dog creature. I believe it's a Dogman, but my parents aren't cryptid people at all. They don't know what to call it. What could this animal be? Am I wrong for assuming it to be a Dogman? Thank you for listening. I live in Texarkana. Well, actually, right outside of town, and I witnessed something that I can't explain. I went out drinking with a couple of buddies of mine. I'm only in high school, so drinking is not something we could legally do yet. Me and my buddies took his pickup truck and parked in a much more secluded area just to have a few beers in peace and bullshit. My friend just started dating this really hot girl, and so we all wanted the details on that. We had driven a little ways into the thicker forested area, a little ways out of town, but I knew we wouldn't be bothered by police out there. During the summer, this area is pretty peaceful. I think there's even a nearby creek too, because you could hear it if you listen closely. We're sitting by ourselves, all having a few beers, and talking about how things are getting hot with my friend and his woman, and we began to hear weird rustling noises. It sounded like something big moving around in the woods close by. We were cautious, but weren't too scared. It was probably just a deer. We resumed our conversation, and then began to hear some strange growling noises. The weirdest thing is, the growling was so deep and bassy. There was no way this was just a big dog. It sounded huge. We were all a little more alert after this because we were starting to wonder what was going on. Like out of a movie, out pops this huge dog head about 30 feet away. All of us drop our beer as the only thing we see is the silhouette of this huge head and glowing red eyes staring at us. Intoxicated or not, we got the hell out of there so fast. We weren't quite sure what we had seen, but this thing was huge. I don't know if someone was trying to play a prank on us or what, but nothing will be able to explain the heavy rustling I heard. We all felt dread too, right before this thing popped its head out to show itself. We only looked at it for a few seconds before wanting to fly out. None of us really talked about it, and I don't want to go back to that area. I don't know if it was a werewolf or a demon or what. I'm not really sure if there's any explanation for what it could have been. I didn't like the way it made me feel. I didn't like the vibe it gave off. I felt like it wanted to hurt us and that we didn't belong there. I'm glad we never stuck around to find out. I remember waking up one night. I want to say it was around 2 or 3 a.m. in the morning to my dog whimpering and crying. It was pretty severely distressed, and it really concerned me. I jumped up out of bed to run out to my backyard, where I had heard my dog whimpering just a few moments before. As I make it to my back door, my back porch light illuminated enough of our yard that I could see my dog on the ground, with a lot of blood. The worst thing was that it seemed like there was some large shadow looming over my dog that resembled a werewolf. It was shaggy, standing on two legs, and the first thing that shook me to the core was I noticed these horrible glowing eyes and these tall, pointed ears. I literally froze where I was standing, thinking some demon had made its way out of the silver screen to come and terrorize my entire family. I noticed as the back light came on, this thing noticed and looked right up at me. All I saw was shadows and the glowing eyes, and then this thing took off faster than I've ever seen. It was a blur of shadow that faded back into the darkness. I was terrified of what was out there, but I had to go help my dog. I grabbed my flashlight and ran out there to see what had happened. As I approached him, I dropped to my knees and began sobbing. Whatever that thing was, that demon, that abomination standing over my dog, had torn my dog's throat clean out. Blood was not only covering my dog, but all the grass around him. He was my best friend for years and had gotten me through some rough times. He was gone now. I knew that beast was still around in the area, probably watching me, waiting for me to turn my back so it could do the same to me as it did to my dog. I spent the next couple weeks obsessing over what this thing could be. I did extensive research, spent time listening to many YouTube videos, reading articles and encounters, and doing everything I could to find out what this was. It sounds like I came across a Dogman, and sure enough, I live in Oklahoma. Tulsa County, specifically. Here seems to be a hotbed of encounters with these bastards. I still struggle with the death of my dog, and I wish that night I would have had a shotgun. I could have taken this thing's head clean off. I live in eastern Texas. It gets pretty hot down here in the summertime, and, like most people, I enjoy spending my time out swimming and cooling down. I don't do well with the heat. I never have. That's why I like to also lock myself away in my bedroom and play video games. This particular night, I was actually over at a friend's house. He had just gotten one of the newer Fortnite Xboxes that had come out, and we were spending a good portion of time gaming out. My friend lives in a pretty normal suburban area. He has a few neighbors around him. His driveway leads to a street that goes throughout the neighborhood. On the other side of the street, it dips down about 5 or so feet to a really large undeveloped field that I would believe is probably around an acre. Like I said, it's undeveloped land, so it's just tall grass at this point. Back a little ways is all woods, but I've been to my friend's house many times and have never thought anything of this. I had parked my car near his driveway. It was roughly midnight when I remember hearing glass shatter. It sounded like it was just outside my friend's house. We both freaked out and ran outside to see what it was. It sounded like one of our cars were being broken into. We rushed outside to see this large figure on 4 legs run off into the field. My car's driver's side window had been shattered. There were scratches all along the side of my car. It looked like a huge bear had drug its claws along my vehicle. The glass was shattered like something was trying to get in. My first thought was a grizzly bear was trying to break into my car. But after we came outside and saw this thing take off, it was so fast and so lean. My guess was a large dog, but I've never seen a dog run off like that. It was just too big. I never saw any details or anything like that, other than a large four-legged figure take off. Turns out, I left an older burger underneath my seat that I had forgotten about. I don't know if that's what this thing was after, but I will never leave food in my car again after that. This happened back in the winter of '93. I was having a nice family dinner at my girlfriend's parents' place. They had just bought this huge house and property out in the boonies and invited me out for a big dinner. After dinner, I was driving back home, and their driveway connects to a long gravel road that eventually leads out to the main road. This was around 8 or so at night, so it was pitch black outside. As I'm driving on this gravel road, I'm only doing about 20 miles an hour. I see these ears pop up on the right side of the road in the ditch, and I first think to myself, what kind of dog is that? Then, this thing stands up on two legs and walks over the road into the woods. This thing was holding a dead deer in its arms. This thing was actually holding a dead deer and was clearly eating it. It had blood on its muzzle and all over its hands. My headlights shined on it enough in those few seconds of it crossing the road for me to see enough. I just stopped the car, threw it in reverse, and drove back to my girlfriend's parents' place and stayed the night. I told them I felt ill and needed to sleep because I knew they wouldn't believe me if I told them what I had seen. I didn't notice any eye shine or huge fangs or anything like that. It just looked like a big wolf that was standing on two legs, fairly large and hairy, just like a wolf would be. I didn't really pay attention to much of the face other than the blood on its muzzle. I was more concerned that it was holding a deer in its hands, and I must have interrupted its meal. I'm glad I wasn't the next meal. Back during my senior year in high school, I was just 18 and probably getting ready to graduate. Living in a more out-of-town area in Oklahoma at the time, this was just any old regular school night. My parents both worked early morning jobs. My dad was a tile guy and kept pretty busy working consistent jobs, so since he and my mother both had to be up early in the morning, they both crashed out pretty early. Around 8 p.m. was their usual bedtime, and so I would always stay up till midnight. Myself, I was a night owl. I enjoyed my nighttime to myself. I could unwind without having to have my dad or mom down my neck about anything. On this night, I was watching TV in my room, just relaxing on my bed. I heard my dog start to growl really loud at something. He was by the back, sliding glass doors. It's not really like him to growl at anything. He's a pretty passive dog. So much so that he would make a terrible self-defense animal. He's just an old family dog who's had too much of the good life to be in any way aggressive. So you could see why this alarmed me. I got up out of bed to go see what my dog was growling at. Out in the distance of the night was this hulking, What had to be 10 to 12 feet tall werewolf with eyes glowing red, walking out along the land while every few strides would stop and stare in our direction. Then just keep moving. I watched this thing for 5 seconds before it moved far enough into the darkness just to where I couldn't see this thing at all anymore. My dog is beginning to freak out and being so loud now that my parents are awake. They're pissed, and I just downplay the situation because I know they wouldn't believe me. I just tell them our dog saw something outside. What disturbs me is that looking back, I was terrified after I saw this thing. I must have been pale as a sheet because even though my parents were pissed that they were awoken, they seemed concerned by how I was acting. After playing it off, they didn't really dig too much deeper, and we all went back to bed. I didn't really sleep until 5 or so in the morning, just of pure exhaustion. I don't know what the hell I saw, and I know it gets crazy out in these parts, but I never knew werewolf-like creatures inhabited this land. The only other thing I can think of is that I know there's a lot of occultism and black magic practiced in these desolate areas. It's possible what I could have saw was a product of that. I'm not too sure. It never did come back, and I never saw it again after that. I grew up in Nevada, a little area near Walker Lake to be exact. Around Walker Lake is Highway 95, which runs all the way to Reno. Growing up in the area, you hear all sorts of bizarre tales about creatures and what they call skinwalkers. I'm not native or practice any rituals or anything like that, so I don't know too much about it. I grew up with many friends in a nearby small town of Hawthorne who have told me encounters they have had with bizarre creatures of the night. One of my friends told me about how one night he heard something calling his name outside of his house. Whatever it was mimicking the voice of his mother. It scared him to death because he knew his mother was sleeping in the bedroom next to him. He said that after a few moments of his supposed mother calling him outside, the voice began to get angry and began shouting his name and all other sorts of obscenities before going dead silent. He said then that whatever it was walked along the side of his house and tapped on his windows and left all sorts of weird markings along the house. He told me he could feel its presence when it was around, and that it felt like evil. He told me there were some nights where he could see the silhouette of what he can only describe to me as a werewolf outside of his window. He told me he taught himself to look away and to hide his face in his bed because he never wanted to see what this thing looked like. I believe every single word because when he tells me these stories, he gets so shaken up and his eyes welt up. You can tell there is genuine fear. He says he doesn't know if it's a skinwalker or a werewolf or what it is, but he hates whenever it's around. I have another friend that out by his house, he will see this tall dog coyote-looking thing walking around in the distance sometimes. This is a friend that loves exploring and doing stuff, but since seeing this thing, in the past few months, he tries to stay inside as much as possible. Fortunately for me, I haven't had any real encounters with anything like this, but since my friends live so close, maybe that luck will be short-lived. If I told you I wasn't terrified, I would be lying. I know there is supposed skinwalkers and such in the area, but I don't know too much about that, and I'm not able to really give you an accurate yes or no. The only thing I could really say is I hope I'm left alone and won't ever have to deal with what my friends deal with. This happened back in 1991. What I'm about to share with you was probably one of the most terrifying and horrific experiences of my life. For starters, I lived in Oklahoma and would prefer to not disclose the location. I liked keeping to myself, and I liked things private. I'm not a huge people person and have never been. To me, I find peace in solitude and isolation. I always have. I don't really have that many neighbors, and the nearest one is a little ways away. I've never had any issues in the past with people coming onto my property or up to my house, which is one of the reasons why I live out where I do. However, I'm still fairly well trained in self-defense and keep weapons around my house, just in case of anything. When it comes to weapons, I don't mess around. I don't aim to injure or to stun. I aim to kill, because at that point, I'm going against an intruder who's going after my life. Right next to my bedside, I keep a little Smith & Wesson's .44 Magnum. It's not meant to kill a bear, but it's definitely going to take someone down who comes into my house to hurt me. I know family and friends have called me crazy for keeping weapons like that around, but I don't trust people. I haven't had the brightest past, and it makes me feel safe. On this particular night that I'm going to tell you about, reassured me that the weapons I keep are more than suitable. I don't ever feel the need to have surveillance systems or anything like that around my house. I've never had intruders before, like I said. I'm a pretty light sleeper, so I've always trusted my gut and instinct to alert me in the throes of danger. It's helped me out before, and this instance was no different. I awoke to the sound of glass shattering at about 2:30 or so in the morning. I then heard the door handle jiggle violently and the back door bust open. It sounded like someone was using a battering ram to get through. I immediately went into code red as I knew someone had broken into my home. I lay there quiet in bed as I heard the sound of heavy thudding. Whoever this was must have been big or wearing heavy boots or something. Immediately, I reached over to my end of the table and pulled out my gun, and I slowly sat up out of bed. Outside of my bedroom is a long, straight hallway that leads down to my kitchen where the back door is. Whoever this was making an awful lot of noise and wasn't even trying to keep quiet. There was so much rustling and noise. I thought how strange this was. Then, it went completely silent. I stood up and crept quietly by my door and waited, debating with myself if I should go and investigate or not. I tightly gripped my weapon and opened up my door and pointed my gun down my dark hallway. What I saw next took my breath away. I will have nightmares about this for a long time, and I'm having a hard time writing this. The first thing I saw when I pointed my weapon down the hallway were eyes. 2 glowing amber-colored eyes looking back at me. These eyes were on something of massive size, barely able to fit in my hallway. Whatever this was slowly approaching me, coming down the hallway. I was frozen in place, my jaw dropped, and I felt the most primal fear anyone could ever feel. There's a window on the side of my hallway that shone light in from the moon. As this thing stepped closer to me, it became more visible in the moonlight. I was able to see more and more details. It stopped and slowly lowered its head right before the window. I could make out clearly that it was a giant hairy wolf standing on two legs. With the most intense stare I've ever felt from any animal, this thing pulled back its gums and exposed its teeth and growled at me menacingly. My hand froze on the gun, but I knew this animal was getting ready to pounce and end my life. The next moments were a blur. Between continuously firing my magnum and the screams and howls I heard, there was a lot of blood. After I emptied the entire gun into this thing, I still kept trying to pull the trigger, only to get the click-click sound as the chamber was empty. Whatever I encountered was now dead. This thing was now a bloody, mangled mess of fur. I didn't even want to get near it and check if it was dead. I stood there for a moment and silence overcame the area. I still had my gun pointed at this thing, waiting for it to get back up. After just a few more moments, I lowered my gun. I couldn't step over this thing to go outside since its body was blocking up the entire hallway, and blood being everywhere. There was so much gore. I walked back into my bedroom and called the police. I told them that a large animal had broken in and tried to kill me, but I killed it. Within 10 minutes, 5 cop cars pulled up on my property. I was still shaken up with what had happened, and multiple officers were coming in the house, asking and yelling to me if I was okay. They saw the body of whatever that thing was. They told me to stay where I was until they could remove the body to get to me. After some more time had passed, multiple officers had managed to move enough of this thing's mangled body to reach me. Instead of being asked if I was okay and being properly treated, I was detained and put in the cop car. I wasn't told a thing, and the officers all talked in hushed tones about what the situation entailed. I was taken down to the station and basically told I wasn't allowed back to my house. They said my property now belonged to the federal government and was going to be needed for surveying, they told me. They'd put me up in a motel for a few days and gave me some options of other states to go. I eventually moved back west where my grandparents had owned property and I had other family there in the area. I eventually was able to rework my life, but I'll never understand what happened that night. What was that thing I encountered, and why did the police and government have the right to strip my property out from underneath my feet?